Good morning, class. Professor Prante here. Welcome. How are you? New stuff in this video. Here with this chapter, we're focusing on that chapter in our textbook called America's Growing Labor Consciousness. I like this chapter because when a lot of us spend a lot of time at work, even if we're doing it remotely right now, and a lot of what we encounter at work, the norms, the laws, things that we take for granted today, first came to be and first developed in this time period that we're going to talk about today. So things like overtime pay, right? If you at your job today work more than 40 hours in a week or more than 8 hours in a day, you can expect that your employer is going to pay you overtime. It's a common practice in the United States that if you get hurt on the job, you can expect your employer to compensate you for that, take care of your medical bills. It's a common practice in the United States that the way that work is organized is that we work during the work week and then have the weekend for our own time. All of these sort of things came to be in the late 1800s, this time period that we've been focusing on so much. So the big focus then here for this first video in the unit is to kind of set the stage for what's happening here with workers in the late 1800s. One of the things that I hope you get from this is that the nature of the labor force, the composition of the labor force, who was working, was evolving at this time. I'm going to use some whiteboards here to try to hammer home the points that you guys should get from this, right? So point number one, in terms of how the labor force, the labor force was changing during the late 1800s, was that labor became more urbanized. Okay, people were moving to cities, in other words. One punchline from our previous unit was that during the late 1800s, there was this evolution where we still had farming, of course, but agriculture was a less important part of the economy, and factory production or industrial production became more important. And so as the stuff that we're making changed, the sort of jobs that existed changed likewise. Where those jobs were located changed as well. And so people were moving away from rural areas towards cities. A larger share of our population lived in cities, a larger share of jobs, of course, going hand in hand with that, were jobs that could be found in urban areas. That's one big change that we saw. Instead of people being much more spread out, they're condensing into cities in the late 1800s. All right. Another big change that we saw was that precisely who was going to work changed. During the late 1800s, we saw dramatic increases in something called the labor force participation rate for women. Women in this period of time were working outside of the home at much higher rates than they had previously. Take note in the careful way that we've worded this, right? Remember, labor force participation is not saying that you're doing work. It's simply saying that you're doing work outside of the home. And so women then and now, people who are not participating in the labor force then and now are, of course, working in one sense of the word, but not going to a job where they're receiving monetary compensation for it. As people are moving to cities, right, you're seeing this changing dynamic at home for a lot of people, and women, for the first time, are participating in the labor force at higher rates. Our textbook gives some good numbers that support this conclusion. I've taken these numbers straight from the text. In the year 1880, for example, when you look at the overall size of the labor force, 15% of the labor force was made up by women. By the year 1900, it was up to 18%. By the year 1920, it was up to 20%. And of course, today it's far, far higher than that. And so we're seeing here this labor force participation rate ticking up for women at the end of the 1800s, beginning of our 1900s. What were women doing? What sort of jobs were women working? Well, of course, women were not free to choose whatever job they were interested in working. Instead, they faced far more discrimination than a person might face today. Women worked a particular type of job in this period of time in history. It was common for women at the time to work clerical jobs, sales jobs. Women would work as teachers. Women would work in some cases producing clothing. Some of this was due to norms at the time, where it just wasn't done that women would go into certain lines of work and not other lines of work. But there's also evidence that there were explicit laws that governed and provided rules for the way in which women would work at the time. One that's notable is that during the late 1800s, there were laws in place that put a cap on the maximum number of hours that a woman would be allowed to work. There were also caps that put maximums on the wages that women might receive for that work. So sort of like the opposite of a minimum wage, there were maximum wage laws for women, which seems wrong, doesn't it? All right, our takeaway, guys, and I think this is coming through, is that women were working more in the formal labor force during the late 1800s. All right, women were not the only group who was working more. In addition to women entering the labor force in higher numbers, kids did too. Children were participating in the formal labor force at much higher rates than had been seen before. This is something that I would view as a negative. I expect a lot of people would. Let me give some numbers on this. In the year 1880, there were 1 million children aged 10 to 15 who were working in the formal labor force. Come the year 1910, 2 million kids of the same age, in the same age group were working. And this represented a pretty big slice or a pretty big share of the overall labor force. In 1910, those 2 million kids that were participating in the labor force, that was 20% of all the kids that age at the time. 1 in 5 kids aged 10 to 15 at the time were participating in the labor force. Further, kids in this age cohort, in this little band of ages here, age 10 to 15, represented 5%, just over 5% of the overall labor force. So kids were working more as well. Finally, then, the last big point about how labor was changing and evolving during the late 1800s was that people were encountering dangerous work. It was much more common as people are working in factories and working in these crowded, urbanized settings that they're going to encounter workplace accidents. So, against this backdrop, then, of people moving to cities, more people participating in the formal labor force, workers encountering dangerous situations at work, we're going to start to see, for the first time, workers negotiating collectively for themselves. In other words, relying upon labor unions. All right, and so that's going to be the big topic for our next video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye now.